There is a particular kind of exhaustion that people with AuDHD describe, and it is different from ordinary tiredness, different from burnout in the way most people use that word, different even from the specific exhaustions that autism and ADHD each produce on their own. It is the exhaustion of a nervous system that is simultaneously craving routine and resisting it. Desperately wanting deep connection and finding the social performance required to get there almost unbearable. Hyper-focusing on a special interest with total absorption and being completely unable to initiate the 5-minute administrative task that has been on the list for 3 weeks. Needing predictability to feel safe and being wired for novelty, seeking in ways that make predictability feel like a cage. Caring intensely, about everything, all at once, with no reliable way to turn the volume down. If any of that landed for you, if you recognized something in that description that you have been living without a name for, this video is for you. AuDHD is the term used by many in the neurodiversity community, and increasingly in clinical literature, for the co-occurrence of autism spectrum condition and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder in the same person. It is not a formal DSM diagnosis. It is a lived reality for an extraordinarily large number of people. And it is one of the most underrepresented, most frequently misdiagnosed, and most inadequately supported neurological profiles in all of mental health care. Today we are building a complete picture, the history of why it was missed, what makes AuDHD its own distinct experience, the specific ways the two neurotypes interact and conflict, masking and burnout, the diagnostic challenges, and what genuinely helpful support looks like. The AuDHD cheat sheet is linked in the description. Let's start at the beginning. Section 1. A brief history. Why AuDHD was missed so long. Until 2013, the DSM explicitly prohibited the simultaneous diagnosis of autism and ADHD. If you met criteria for autism, you could not also be diagnosed with ADHD, the assumption being that the attentional and behavioral features of ADHD were better explained by the autism diagnosis alone and did not warrant a separate diagnostic category. This exclusionary rule was not based on robust evidence. It was based on a clinical convention that reflected the limited understanding of both conditions at the time, and it had consequences that are still being felt today in the diagnostic histories of millions of people who were missed, undersupported, or misidentified for years as a result. The DSM-5, published in 2013, removed the exclusion. Both diagnoses could now be given to the same person. And the research that has accumulated since then has not just confirmed that co-occurrence is possible, it has revealed that co-occurrence is extraordinarily common. Current estimates suggest that between 50 and 70% of autistic individuals also meet criteria for ADHD, and that between 20 and 50% of individuals with ADHD also meet criteria for autism. These are not marginal overlap numbers. They suggest that for a very large proportion of people in both populations, a single condition diagnosis may be missing half the picture. Why was the co-occurrence so invisible for so long? Several reasons, which are worth understanding because they continue to affect diagnosis today. First, the early clinical conceptualizations of both conditions were built primarily on research conducted with young white boys, a population that represents one presentation of each condition but is far from the only one. Second, ADHD in autistic individuals was routinely attributed to the autism itself. The attentional features were seen as part of the autism, not as a co-occurring and distinct neurological profile requiring separate recognition and support. Third, autism in individuals with ADHD was frequently masked, concealed beneath the social and behavioral adaptations that ADHD individuals develop, and the diagnostic conventions of the time were not calibrated to detect it. The result was a generation, many generations, of people who were diagnosed with one condition, supported for one condition, and quietly struggling with the other without language, without recognition, and without the specific support that the full picture of their neurology required. Section 2. AuDHD is not autism plus ADHD. This is the most important clinical and conceptual point in the entire video, and it is the one most frequently missed in both clinical training and popular discussion of the co-occurrence. AuDHD is not the experience of having autism and then additionally having ADHD sitting alongside it. It is not two separate neurological profiles, occupying the same brain with their separate characteristics running independently. It is the experience of two neurotypes that interact, that modify each other, that produce emergent features that neither condition produces alone, and that sometimes pull in directly opposite directions in ways that create a lived experience qualitatively different from either condition in isolation. The analogy that is most useful here is color mixing rather than color stacking. Autism and ADHD are not two colors placed side by side. They are two colors mixed together, and the result is something that has its own properties, its own qualities, its own challenges and gifts that are not simply the sum of the two originals. What this means practically is that many of the frameworks developed for autism alone, and many of the frameworks developed for ADHD alone, do not translate cleanly to AuDHD, because they were designed for a single neurotype and do not account for the specific interaction effects that the co-occurrence produces. Support strategies that work well for ADHD may conflict with autistic needs. Approaches designed for autism may be undermined by ADHD features. And the person at the center of this, trying to navigate both simultaneously with frameworks that were not designed for them, experiences a level of complexity and confusion that is frequently attributed to their own inadequacy rather than to the genuine difficulty of navigating a poorly understood neurological profile with inadequate support. This is why the AuDHD framing, treating the co-occurrence as its own distinct experience rather than as two parallel diagnoses, is not merely semantic. It is the difference between support that is designed for who you actually are and support that is designed for someone else. Section 3. The conflict within, when the two neurotypes pull against each other. One of the defining features of AuDHD, and one of the most exhausting, is the experience of internal conflict produced by neurological features of the two conditions that are not merely different but actively opposed. Understanding these conflicts is essential for both self-understanding and for designing support that acknowledges the real complexity of the experience. The most fundamental conflict is between the autistic need for predictability, routine, and sameness, and the ADHD drive toward novelty, stimulation, and variety. Autism often experiences routine as regulating. The predictable schedule, the familiar sequence, the known environment provides the nervous system with the safety that allows function and prevents overwhelm. ADHD often experiences routine as deadening. The familiar schedule loses its novelty, the known environment stops providing adequate stimulation, and the brain begins actively seeking disruption of the very predictability that the autistic part is depending on for regulation. The result in lived experience is a person who sets up the routine they need and then blows it up. Who creates the predictable structure and then finds it intolerable. Who is simultaneously desperate for sameness and driven toward novelty, and who may not have language for why they keep undermining their own regulatory strategies, because the conflict is not between the person and their choices, but between two neurological systems within the same nervous system pulling in opposite directions. The second major conflict is between the autistic tendency toward hyposensitivity or hypersensitivity to sensory input, often both in different modalities, and the ADHD tendency toward sensory seeking as a regulation strategy. The ADHD nervous system frequently seeks stimulation, movement, noise, tactile input, as a way of achieving the arousal level required for focus and regulation. The autistic nervous system may find exactly that stimulation overwhelming or dysregulating in the same moment. The person is simultaneously seeking and being dysregulated by the same sensory environment. This produces a chronic, often invisible management challenge that is extraordinarily taxing and that looks, from the outside, like mood instability, rigidity, or difficulty with transitions when it is actually a nervous system managing two conflicting sensory regulatory systems simultaneously. The third conflict is between the ADHD's impulsivity and the autism's rigid rule following. ADHD drives toward the immediate, the spontaneous, the impulsive departure from the plan. Autism may have deeply internalized rules about how things should be done, the right order, the correct procedure, and violation of those rules produces genuine distress. The ADHD part impulsively deviates from the rule. The autistic part experiences that deviation as catastrophically dysregulating. The person then experiences a shame and self-recrimination cycle that looks like an emotional regulation problem but is actually the consequence of two neurological imperatives in direct collision. And the fourth conflict, one that affects relationships profoundly, is between the autistic experience of social interaction as effortful, draining, and requiring significant recovery time, and the ADHD experience of social interaction as stimulating, activating, and sometimes urgently craved as a source of the novelty and dopamine that the ADHD nervous system needs. The AuDHD person may crave connection intensely and find the execution of it exhausting. May pursue social engagement and need days to recover from it. May feel deeply lonely in isolation and deeply overwhelmed in company, with no position that feels sustainable. Section 4. Masking and burnout in AuDHD. Masking, the effortful suppression or camouflage of neurodivergent traits in order to pass as neurotypical in social and professional contexts, is a feature of both autism and ADHD independently. In AuDHD, the masking load is compounded by the need to manage two sets of traits simultaneously, the internal conflicts we just described, and the frequent experience of having neither condition recognized or understood by the people around them. Autistic masking involves learning and performing social scripts, suppressing self-stimulatory behaviors, monitoring and modifying every aspect of social presentation in real time, maintaining eye contact that feels deeply uncomfortable, and doing all of this continuously, without acknowledgement, while simultaneously processing the sensory and social information of the environment. The cognitive and energetic cost of sustained autistic masking is enormous, and research has clearly linked it to elevated rates of anxiety, depression, and autistic burnout. ADHD masking involves the constant management of impulsivity, the suppression of hyperactivity, the performance of attention and engagement in contexts where the ADHD brain is struggling to maintain them, and the exhausting work of appearing organized and on top of things when the internal experience is far from it. ADHD masking is its own significant load, and in many people, particularly women and girls, it is sufficiently effective that the ADHD is never identified, with the person instead receiving diagnoses of anxiety or depression that address the symptom without identifying the source. In AuDHD, these two masking loads operate simultaneously. The person is managing the autistic mask and the ADHD mask in every social and professional context, at a combined energetic cost that is not simply additive but exponential, because the two masks interact with each other and with the internal conflicts already described. Managing the ADHD impulsivity while also managing the autistic social performance, while also managing the sensory environment, while also managing the internal conflict between novelty seeking and routine needing. All of this, all of the time, without the resources being replenished by the social interaction that is consuming them. Burnout in AuDHD, sometimes called autistic burnout, though the ADHD component is inseparable from it, is the consequence of sustained masking without adequate recovery. It presents as a profound loss of functioning. The capacities that were maintained through effortful masking, social engagement, executive function, sensory tolerance, emotional regulation, become unavailable. The person who was managing looks suddenly like they are no longer managing at all. This is frequently misread as a new mental health crisis, as regression, or as evidence that the previous functioning was not genuine. It is none of those things. It is the consequence of a nervous system that has been running beyond capacity for too long, that has finally reached a limit, and that needs genuine, sustained, unmasked recovery rather than increased performance demands. Section 5. Diagnosis challenges. Why AuDHD is so often missed or misread. The diagnostic picture of AuDHD is complicated by several factors that conspire to delay, obscure, or entirely prevent accurate identification, and understanding these factors is important both for individuals seeking diagnosis and for the clinicians responsible for providing it. The masking problem is the first and most significant diagnostic challenge. Both autism and ADHD can be masked sufficiently effectively, particularly in individuals who are intelligent and who have developed sophisticated compensatory strategies, that the clinical presentation does not match the diagnostic criteria in the straightforward way that assessment tools are designed to detect. The clinician who sees a composed, articulate, apparently organized adult in the assessment room may not see the hours of preparation that made that presentation possible, the exhaustion that follows it, or the private reality of a person whose life outside the clinical room looks nothing like the person in it. The gender bias in diagnostic frameworks is a second critical factor. The diagnostic criteria for both autism and ADHD were developed primarily from research on males, and the presentation of both conditions in females, non-binary individuals, and people of color is frequently different from the criteria in ways that assessment tools are not adequately calibrated to detect. Autistic females, for instance, frequently present with strong social motivation and elaborate masking that makes the social communication differences less immediately visible. ADHD in females more commonly presents with inattentive features and emotional dysregulation rather than hyperactivity. AuDHD in people who were not included in the research that built the diagnostic frameworks will frequently not be recognized by those frameworks. The interaction effects themselves create diagnostic confusion. When the autistic need for routine is visible but the ADHD-driven disruption of that routine is also present, the clinical picture can look like anxiety, mood instability, or oppositional behavior, rather than the internal neurological conflict that is actually occurring. When the ADHD impulsivity is masked by the autistic rule following, neither feature may be clearly visible. When the autistic social difficulties are compensated for by the ADHD's social enthusiasm and novelty seeking, the autism may be entirely missed. The two conditions can obscure each other in ways that make each individually less recognizable. For clinicians, AuDHD assessment requires a genuinely thorough developmental history, explicit attention to masking and compensation, familiarity with the presentations of both conditions across genders and cultures, and the clinical humility to recognize that the person in the room may be performing a version of themselves that is several layers removed from their actual neurological experience. The most important clinical tool is probably the question that creates the most access to the unmasked reality: what does it cost you to function in the ways that you do? Section 6. What genuinely helpful support looks like. Genuinely helpful support for AuDHD is not simply the combination of autism support and ADHD support. It is support designed specifically for the interaction, for the conflicts, the compounded masking, the burnout vulnerability, and the specific complexity of navigating two neurotypes in a world designed for neither. The most fundamental shift in AuDHD support is from deficit-focused to profile-aware. The AuDHD person is not a neurotypical person with two deficits. They are a person with a specific, complex neurological profile that has genuine challenges and genuine strengths, and support that is organized around reducing the challenges without acknowledging the strengths, or that pathologizes the neurology rather than adapting the environment, will produce masking and shame rather than genuine well-being. Accommodating the internal conflicts rather than trying to eliminate them is essential. The routine versus novelty conflict, for instance, is not something to be resolved in favor of one side or the other. It is something to be accommodated, building predictability and structure into the environment while also building in planned novelty and variety. A menu-based approach to routine rather than a rigid one, where the sequence and structure are stable but the specific contents can rotate. This honors both neurological needs rather than forcing a choice between them. Reducing the masking load is both a support strategy and a health imperative. For AuDHD individuals, unmasking is not about being difficult or inappropriate, it is about removing a chronic energetic drain that is directly linked to burnout risk. Safe environments, therapeutic relationships, chosen communities, home environments that allow the person to unmask, stim, use noise-canceling headphones, move their body, speak directly without social performance, and regulate their sensory environment, and not accommodations in the sense of special treatment. They are the conditions under which the AuDHD nervous system can function without continuously spending the resources required for sustained masking. For therapeutic support specifically, the neurodiversity affirming framework is non-negotiable. Therapeutic goals should be oriented toward the person's own values and well-being, not toward making them more neurotypical. Psychoeducation about both neurotypes and their specific interaction effects reduces the self-blame and confusion that almost universally accompanies late diagnosis. And the therapeutic relationship itself, consistent, predictable, sensory considerate, tolerant to direct communication styles, patient with the executive function variability that affects session-to-session consistency, is itself one of the most powerful therapeutic interventions available for this population. The AuDHD cheat sheet in the description covers all of this: the key concepts, the interaction effects, the masking and burnout framework, the diagnostic picture, and the support principles, in one organized, accessible reference for individuals, families, and clinicians. If you have been trying to make sense of yourself through a single lens, only autism, only ADHD, or neither, and finding that something essential keeps slipping through the gaps of the framework, this may be why. AuDHD is not a niche diagnosis or a complexity that only applies to a small number of people. It is the lived reality of a very large number of people who have been navigating their neurology without the full picture and, in many cases, without any adequate support at all. You are not too much and also not enough. You are not contradicting yourself when the routine you built feels like a cage 3 days later. You are not failing when the mask gets too heavy to hold. You are an AuDHD nervous system doing one of the most complex neurological management jobs in existence, often with inadequate information, inadequate support, and a cultural framework that was not built for you. Understanding your neurology is not the end of the work. But it is the beginning of the possibility of doing the work with the right framework. And the right framework, one that sees both parts, honors the interaction between them, and is designed for the actual complexity of the experience, makes an enormous difference. The AuDHD cheat sheet is in the description. Share this video with someone who has been told they cannot possibly have both. The research, and a very large community of people living this experience, have something important to say about that. And I will see you in the next one.